Alright, I'll just start from the very beginning. I was around 12 years old when this happened. I'm 33 now, but thinking about what happened that night still gives me goosebumps to this day. For some context, I think I should mention that I grew up on a very large farm in the middle of nowhere in southern Idaho. It wasn't way out in the mountains like you might be thinking though. It was just nothing but grass and hills for miles on end. My mom and dad were both raised in big cities, so when they got married, they figured they'd give their kids more of a farm sort of life to grow up in, and I always loved it. We had goats, chickens, ducks, turkeys, you name it, we had it. The only thing I didn't have was much more freedom from my parents. My dad was a goat farmer, and his job was working on the farm. He sold goat milk, made cheese, and of course sold the meat as well. My mom was a stay-at-home mother, so she was around all the time, which basically meant I had no alone time and no privacy either. When I was little, I didn't really mind it that much. I loved having my parents around so often. I helped my dad with the farm work and taking care of all the animals. I was always in the kitchen baking and cooking with my mother. By the time I reached middle school, though, I was all ready to grow up. I guess I started doing what every kid does when they hit puberty. I started to pull away from my parents. It was hard, and my parents hated it, of course. I think they especially hated it because my brother was so much older than me, and he had already left the house by that point. I was their little baby girl, and they weren't quite ready for the teenager rebellious phase to hit yet. Every weekend, we would go out to dinner as a family. We would meet up with my brother and his girlfriend and have a lot of fun. This night, though, I really just wanted to stay home. My mom insisted I go with them, and when I refused, she offered to stay with me, so I wouldn't be home all alone. I begged and begged her, though, to just let me stay there by myself. Finally, after what felt like forever, she agreed. My dad wasn't all too happy about it, but she told him everything would be fine. Besides, if I needed anything, I could just call them anyway. They were only going to be about a 45-minute drive away in the city. Now all alone, for the first time in my life, I felt free. That night, my mom and dad gave me a big hug and a kiss and said their goodbyes. They gave me the rundown that all parents give when leaving their kids home alone for the first time. Cell phones, what restaurant they'd be at, calling 911 for an emergency, it all went in one ear and out the other. I was just looking forward to staying up late and watching shows I wasn't supposed to watch. You know, normal kid stuff. I should also mention we had a German Shepherd named Ghost at the time. He was an all-white German Shepherd, and I always thought he looked a bit more like a wolf. My parents got him when I was just a baby, and we'd grown up together. He was like my shadow. I'm sure having him around with me gave my parents some additional peace of mind when leaving me that night. They finally left at 7 p.m., and I was so excited. I heard my parents pull out of the driveway, and I jumped onto the couch in seconds. Ghost joined me, and we watched TV for a while. An hour went by, and nothing of real significance happened. I used the opportunity to watch shows that my parents didn't normally allow, and deviously ate some candy I'd saved up from Easter a couple of weeks before. An important thing to mention is we didn't have any coverings on any of our windows. We lived in the middle of nowhere, so we weren't really worried about someone trying to peer in. My mom loved the morning sun shining in through the windows anyway, without her having to go around the whole house opening curtains or whatever. After it had been around an hour and a half since my parents left, my mom called to tell me they wouldn't be home when they'd originally said. My brother and his girlfriend wanted to see a movie with them that night. I was honestly super happy I'd be getting even more alone time. I told her it was fine and to go enjoy their movie. During one of the show's commercial breaks, I rushed into the kitchen to grab a bowl of ice cream when I heard Ghost starting to bark in the living room. I figured he'd just seen one of many bats that would fly around this time of night, so I didn't really give it much thought. Only this time he would not stop barking. It was getting so annoying that I even remember yelling at him to stop, but he just wouldn't let up. I walked into the living room, and I couldn't help but scream when I saw what Ghost was barking at. There was a man just standing there, right in front of the window. He was wearing this white rubber Halloween mask that had a huge painted smile on the front. I couldn't see his eyes, but it was insanely creepy. I froze in pure terror as I looked at this man. I could feel him staring back at me. Before I knew it, I was screaming at Ghost to follow me and running upstairs to my parents' bedroom. When I got to the stairs, I just couldn't help myself. I looked back. I had to know if he was still there. He was, only this time his hand was raised and he gave me a slow wave. His head tilted upward, so I was still in his view. I got into the bedroom and locked the door behind me. At this point, I was practically bawling. I regretted staying home alone. Now, all I wanted was my mom and dad. I rushed over to the nightstand and grabbed the landline to call my dad, only to find there was no dial tone. I wasn't too worried about it, considering my father had given me a cell phone to use in emergencies just like this. The only problem was that it was in my room across the hall, and I didn't want to go back to where the masked man could see me. I had no other options, though. It's not like I could just wait around for my parents to come back hours later. With this man skulking about the property, I mustered up every bit of courage I had. I unlocked my bedroom door and ran as fast as I could. In the 10 seconds it took me to get to my room, I noticed the man was not outside the window anymore. The window was open, and he was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I involuntarily screamed as loud as I could. I heard his footsteps beginning to run up after me. Ghost lunged toward the man, barking, which made him hesitate for a moment. That was just long enough for me and Ghost to get into my room and lock the door behind me. I grabbed the phone out of my drawer and dialed 911. The man outside my door began to jiggle the handle. I watched as he tried to get inside my room, the whole time never actually speaking a single word. I think that's what terrified me even more. The operator answered and barely understood me through my hysteria. She got the gist though, and told me that since an officer was already in the area, they would be there in only 5 minutes. She told me to stay on the line until he showed up. I repeated what she'd said out loud. "Okay, so an officer will be here in 5 minutes? He'll be here in 5 minutes, right?" The second I spoke those words, the jiggling stopped all at once. The handle stopped moving. For all I knew, he had completely fled the house. My heart was racing though. I knew I wasn't leaving that room until I was sure the officer was there to help me. Surprisingly, the officer took even less time to arrive than they'd initially stated. I saw the lights outside as he pulled up, and I heard the sirens as well. I heard the officer enter the house and run up the stairs, yelling for the man to get down and put his hands behind his back. That was confirmation to me that the man had never left. I'm so glad I didn't try to exit my room when I thought he had. They arrested the man and one of them took him away, while one of the officers waited with me. I guess they called my parents as well, who rushed home. They ended up finding multiple slain animals on our property, clearly been killed with stab wounds. When the police found him, he was just standing outside my door, staring at it with blood coating his body. He never even looked at them when they came in. The man never said why he did this either. He never actually spoke at all. After this period of time, we did find out that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison to our relief. My mom and dad thought of selling the farm and buying a different place after that traumatic event. Potentially even going to a state across the country where they were sure he would never find us if he did eventually get out, whatever his motivations may have been. The masked man ended up taking his own life in prison though before that could ever happen. To any child out there who wants freedom from their parents while they're still too young, just remember, in your scariest moments, they're the people you'll wish were there the most. I'm a fairly cautious individual. I always told myself I'd never be like other people who get themselves caught in dangerous situations. But that's exactly what happened. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and I currently live with my husband, Sam, and our 3-year-old daughter, Elena. My husband and I both grew up in the area, and when we got married, we decided a nice house on a lot of land would be perfect for us. We'd never exactly been the city living type, and we wanted our daughter to have a lot of space to play in. Over the 5 years that we lived here, we purchased a lot of farm animals off Craigslist. We started off with chickens, then pigs, then eventually goats even. Just over a year ago, I suggested to my husband that it would be nice to get a cow as well. We could milk her and she wouldn't have to have her calf taken away like most dairy cows. We felt we would be doing a good thing. After about 6 months with her though, we realized it was too much work to take care of her and her calf. We wanted them to go to a home that had the time to take proper care of them. I was sad about letting them go, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I suggested to my husband that we list her on Craigslist. He agreed it was a good idea, so I enlisted her immediately. We knew she would sell fast, given that she milked well and came with her calf too. With only a few hours of listing them, we'd gotten already 10 emails. We weeded out all the scams, and one person stood out to us. They said they had a 50-acre farm and other dairy cows too, so they had some experience. They also said they would pick her up themselves as soon as possible for the exact price we were asking. We were so happy they were going to go to such a good-seeming home. The only problem was, my husband was going to be out of town for work the next week. He told me multiple times he was not comfortable with a stranger coming to the farm when he wasn't going to be there. I was a little too trusting, I suppose, because I was positive it would be fine. The people in our area were all good people. I hadn't heard of anything bad coming from animal purchases in the area ever. The people who were coming told me they were a husband and wife pair named John and Betty. I do remember making a little joke to myself that these names were so boring that they almost sounded fake. The thought passed by though and didn't cross my mind again. I gave them our address and told them they could come pick up the cows the next day at around 4. That night, my husband gave my daughter and I a kiss and left for his long work trip. My husband was very serious when it came to leaving us two alone. We had set times we would call each other, and if I ever missed a call, he would immediately alert the police. That may seem dramatic to some people, but that was our routine, and it gave him peace of mind whenever he had to leave. I was more than okay with it because of this. The night came and went without incident. I woke up early at around 6 a.m. to let out all the animals to feed and give them water. They were excited to be out for the day, since it had rained the day before and they had been cooped up inside. Elena always went out with me in the morning. It was cute to see her interacting with all the different animals. I let the cows out for what I thought would be the last time. I rubbed their backs and essentially said my goodbyes. At around 1 p.m., I made Elena and myself something to eat and got her dressed in different clothes for the rest of the night. We sat down on the sofa and waited for 4 o'clock to arrive, when the pair would come to pick the cows up. Throughout the day, I'd done my routine calls with my husband to tell him how we were doing. And if I'm being completely honest, I started to regret letting strangers come to the house without him being there. I just started to have this really horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that I just couldn't shake. John and Betty called me to say they were only 5 minutes away. I went out to the porch to greet them as they pulled up. I had just put Elena down for her nap, so I was completely alone out there. The first thing I noticed when they pulled up was the masks they were both wearing. I immediately ran back up the steps to my house before hearing one of them yell behind me, "No, no, no, you get back here now," in a very thick southern accent that was almost hard to understand. I felt something hard being pressed to my back, and I immediately knew it had to be a gun. I asked them with a shaky voice what they wanted, but I didn't have any cash. They quickly told me to shut up if I wanted to live and to do exactly as they said. The woman, Betty, had a very raspy voice, almost like she'd been smoking for 40 years. I could tell she was also from the South. "You're gonna go inside and get every piece of jewelry you own, put it in the bag and give it straight to me. John here is gonna get whatever he wants, and you won't put up a fight." The first thing I thought of was my daughter. I couldn't let them find Elena. I didn't know what these people were capable of. I told her I'd comply, but I already knew I wasn't going to. I really couldn't. I had to keep my daughter safe. I went inside my house, Betty close behind me as I walked toward the bedroom. My husband kept a shotgun under my bed. I knew if I could just get to it, I might be able to save our lives. "I keep my jewelry box under the bed. I need to get under there to grab it, okay?" My voice was calm at that point because I was worried she was going to suspect something was up. "Whatever, just give me what I asked for," she said. I could feel her spit landing on my face as she talked. She was missing most of her teeth. I wasn't exactly surprised though. Disgusted, but not surprised. I got on my hands and knees on the floor and peered under the bed. There it was, only inches away. I knew I would have to act fast if I was going to get out of this without getting myself and my daughter killed. In as swift a motion as I could, I pulled out the gun from under the bed, and boom, without even aiming or thinking, I fired a shot. The force of the blow blasted Betty off her feet. Her chest was completely blown apart by the blast. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the room, mixed with the scent of her blood, splattered across my walls and floor. She was gone within seconds. I knew without a doubt John would come running in. It was a double barrel, so I'd only have one chance to take him out too. My adrenaline was pumping. I didn't even give a thought to this woman who had just died in my bedroom. All I could think of was keeping my daughter safe. John did come into the room, yelling for Betty. He took one look, and before I could even get a shot off, he was running down the stairs and out the door, screaming Jesus Christ over and over. His voice seemed to be cracking, maybe out of sadness. I ran to get Elena and carried her with me to the front porch, where we sat. The police showed up 30 minutes later, saying my husband had called and said something was wrong at the house. I hadn't called him at our scheduled time, so he knew something was up. I could barely talk though. I swear I had gone into shock. I sat there with my daughter while the officers searched the house and found the body upstairs. As it turns out, of course, those names were fake. They were never able to identify the man, but the woman was someone the officers knew all too well around the area. She'd been arrested multiple times on drug-related charges. That day was the worst and most traumatizing day of my life. It also taught me a valuable lesson though. Never assume strangers are worthy of trust, and never underestimate a mother's love for her child either. I'm a 17-year-old guy with a fairly interesting life, if I say so myself. My mom left when I was pretty young, and my sister and I had been raised by just our dad ever since. We live on a pretty large farm out in the Rocky Mountains, and life, for the most part, is very peaceful. I have some friends who live nearby, at least nearby by our standards. I would regularly make the 3-mile walk to their houses to hang out with them. So, when I asked my dad that night if I could go, he didn't even think twice about saying yes. I had made plans with my friend Jimmy to sleep over, and I was pretty damn excited. Plus, the walk was going to be gorgeous in the afternoon sun. I was 14 at the time, so when I packed my backpack for the journey, I only packed snacks, some Monster energy drinks, and some pajamas. I gave my dad a hug and kissed my baby sister on the forehead before heading out. The first part of the walk was just through some fields. I remember stopping every so often to take pictures with my disposable camera. I like to document the newly developing crops my dad and I had just planted. I regretted only wearing shorts and a tank top though. As the sun beat down on my admittedly very pale skin, I could see myself turning red as the minutes passed by. At the end of our property was a small creek and some barbed wire fencing passing through it. We had it in place to try and deter the wolves and mountain lions in the area. We were sick of losing so many of our animals to them. It's technically illegal to set up wolf traps because it's considered inhumane, but my dad was so angry that he did so anyways, and that brings us to the worst night of my life. I passed through the barbed wire fence and through the creek as well. I'd made it about 40 or so feet into the forest before I heard a loud crunch and felt pressure on my ankle. I remember not understanding what that sound could have been and looking around for a possible source. I started to feel a burning sensation on my leg, and when I looked down, I saw one of the very large wolf traps clenched around and through my leg. The spikes had completely punctured through, and blood was oozing from between the wounds. I began to scream from the pain, hoping someone would hear me and help me out of this, but I was in the middle of the forest, with no one to help me for at least another mile. I felt myself getting lightheaded from the shock and blood loss. I couldn't allow myself to pass out though. This was a situation where I knew I would need all the time I could get, or else I'd bleed out. The only way out of this was for someone to find me, but that would also mean waiting a while. My dad didn't let me have a cell phone, so calling someone was out of the question. My only hope was Jimmy noticing I hadn't shown up and calling my dad. I took off my tank top and tied it around my leg to try and stop the bleeding. At this point, I could no longer even feel my toes. I couldn't feel my whole foot at all. I tried prying open the trap, but as a very skinny teenage boy, that was just not going to happen. I sat there for an hour, trying to figure out any way out of this. The only thing I could think of was to either wait for someone to notice I was missing, or muster up the courage and strength I had left in me to try and crawl back to my house, trap still attached. Thankfully, my dad's laziness was actually a good thing for once, as he'd not bolted the trap down. It started getting dark at that point, so I reached into my backpack and grabbed the pajama shirt I had packed. I put it on. I knew moving at night was not an option. I needed to see where I was going if I was going to drag this heavy trap attached to my leg as I crawled. I found a fairly large tree nearby, and in agonizing pain I crawled over to it. I propped myself up against it and couldn't prevent my eyes from shutting out of pure exhaustion. I woke up to the sound of snapping branches nearby. I looked around, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. I took out my disposable camera and took pictures with the flash, pointing it in every direction to see what was out there. I shook in terror though when I saw two glowing eyes staring back at me in the distance, and heard howling. It was so loud I would have bet my life those wolves were standing right next to me. The night went on for what felt like days. I managed to stay awake until morning light started to peek through the trees. I was just relieved there were no longer any animals surrounding me. I had lost all movement in the lower half of my leg, but the pain was still there in full force. I slung my backpack onto my back and took a deep breath before getting onto my hands and knees and starting to crawl back. The weight of the trap dragging behind me as it pulled on my leg was almost unbearable. It felt like someone was trying to saw my leg off with a rusty butter knife. Every inch I moved felt like torture, but I had to press on. I had finally made it to the 40 feet of creek, but then I came to another obstacle. Sure, the creek was shallow enough to walk through with no problem, but crawling was another story. As I got closer to the water, I could see it was just deep enough to cover my mouth, and my only source of breath was through my nose. The water splashed as I crawled, and I would panic each time some of it shot up through my nostrils, thinking I was going to drown before I ever made it back to the farm. That wasn't the case though. I made it through the creek and took deep breaths, relieved to have survived this part of the journey at least. I started to crawl through the barbed wire fence and screamed in pain when the trap got caught on a rock, basically cutting away at my leg as I unknowingly began pulling it apart. At that point, it started to feel hopeless. I contemplated just giving up. Surely I was going to die here. There was no way I'd be able to make it all the way home. In 4 hours, I'd only made it 50 feet. I lifted my leg from the rock and stared at the fencing in front of me. There was no way I was going to be climbing over. My only way was under. I tried lifting it up as I squeezed underneath, but there was nothing I could do to stop the barbs from digging into the skin on my back. The pain was bad, but it distracted me from the worst pain in my leg, as bizarre as that sounds. It gave me some relief, as inch by inch, I made my way closer to my house. Eventually, I was at the crops again, looking at those plants that I'd admired only the night before. Now they made me angry to even look at. It was a reminder of just how far away I was from home still. I was covered in dirt, sweat, and blood, but the second I could begin to see the frame of my house, I was determined to live. I began picking up the pace as best I could and dragged myself on my elbows, which were scraped and bloody beyond recognition. When I finally made it to the steps outside my house, my body was completely shot. The last thing I remember was my dad yelling when he found me. My leg had to be amputated, and I was in the hospital for a few months from the infections I ended up getting. My dad was fined for the traps and forced to dispose all the ones around the property. My friend had never even thought to call my dad that night. He just assumed I'd gotten in trouble and got grounded and continued on with what he was doing. He felt really guilty about that. I mean, I don't really blame him though. Even though the experience was horrible, I wouldn't change a thing either. It really showed me what it truly means to be alive, and I couldn't be more grateful for the lessons I learned that night.